All right, so looks like for number 1, we asked ourselves first, what does x have to be equal to give me the square root of 0 in my problem? And that's going to be 0. It's pretty straightforward. So then I check, what direction is it going to go in? Is it going to go towards the negatives? Well, if I plug in -1 here, then I get a no solution. So the answer is no. But if I plug in a +1, then I get an answer. I get the square root of 1 times 10. So the answer is yes. So in that case, my domain, all of my possible x values that I can plug in, should be x is greater than or equal to 0. So I'm basically saying I can plug in any values that are 0 or greater and still get an answer. Okay, what's true about number 2? So they're really trying to throw you off by throwing in other numbers here and asking, does it really matter if I add something to the end or multiply something in front? Well, the answer is no, because see, you get the same answer. Because you're not worried about what's going on with the 7. You're just worried about what can I plug into x that will not give me a no solution. And here we see that 0. If I plug in 0, I get square root of 0. And if I check the left side, if I check towards the negatives, I get -1. So if I'm taking the square root of -1, that's a no solution. So I get no. But if I take 1, square root of 1, I get a yes. So then the answer, once again, is x is greater than or equal to 0. So you might be asking, then when am I ever not going to get this as my domain? Well, we get that answer in number 3. So if we look at number 3, we're asking the question, now this is really important because this one is affecting the answer here. Because notice that the 1 is on the inside of the square root. That's how we know that it's affecting the answer. So what can I plug in for x that still gives me an answer of 0 on the inside of here? Well, if I plug in 1, I get -1 plus 1. And -1 plus 1 equals 0. Okay? So my answer here is actually 1. And now when I'm checking the left side and the right side, I need to go down 1. So down 1 from 1 is actually 0. And then I'm going to check the other side. What happens if I go up 1? Up 1 from 1 is actually 2. So let's see what happens. So if I plug in 0, what happens here? Well, this turns into 0, and then the whole thing becomes 0 here, and I still have a 1 left over. Oh, I can take the square root of 1. So yes, I do get an answer. I get a square root of 1. However, if I plug in 2 here, I get -2 plus 1. What's -2 plus 1? -1. Okay, now I've got a negative number that I'm taking the square root of, which means this is a no solution. If that's a no solution, then I'm actually not going to go to the right this time. This time, I actually like the idea of going into the negatives. So my domain for this is x is, so if I'm going towards the negatives, it's actually going to be less than or equal to, and not 0 this time, but it's going to be 1. And that's my answer. If you don't believe me on that, check any value that's less than 1. So we checked 0. We saw 0 works. Check a negative number, all right? -1. Well, negative of a negative makes a positive. So now I'm dealing with 1 plus 1. Okay, that equals 2. So the square root of 2, I can take that. Even though I don't know what it is exactly, I get a crazy decimal, I don't get a no solution. And that's what we're looking for, is what gives me no solution and what gives me a solution, right? Okay, so that's how we do that part. Let's move on. Okay, let's look at graphing a bit more complicated pieces, okay? So let's look at example B, okay? Let's graph this right here. Oops, y equals negative square root of x minus 2, okay? So I just made this pretty complicated. Let's see what happens when we make a table. So in my table, I've got x and y. So I know from the past problem that I probably don't want to mess with negative numbers. In fact, if I check out the domain for this one, where should I actually start with my x values? So if I use my technique from what I just learned, what should I plug in for x that's going to give me 0 as my answer? Well, the answer would be 2. So we would want to start on 2. But just for fun, let's go ahead and start with 0, and you'll see why this doesn't work. So let's just go up by 1s from 0, and you'll see why we don't get values for the first couple problems. And we're actually going to go pretty far with this one. So we'll go up to 6 on this, okay? All right, so let's check 0. So I plug in 0 right here, and I'll work this one out. So here's the work. Y equals negative square root of 0 minus 2, which is equal to the negative square root of negative 2. Oh, I'm taking the square root of a negative number, which means no solution. Okay? Which means can't use that one. And you'll find that the same thing happens if you plug in 1. You get the same thing. You get no solution. So these two are not going to work. However, watch what happens when I plug in 2. 2 minus 2 equals square root. The negative square root of 0, well, guess what? I can take the square root of 0. Square root of 0 is just 0. And we know there's no such thing as a negative 0, so it's just 0 as our answer. So I get 2, 0 as my answer. Okay, let's keep going. Now I'm plugging in 3. So I get negative square root of 1. Well, the square root of 1 is 1, so I get negative 1 as my answer. Remember, we're just taking the negative answers because now we have a negative on the outside here, right? So we're taking the positive answer from here, and then we're adding the negative on the end. Okay, let's keep going. Negative square root of 4 minus 2 equals negative square root 2, which we learned from the last one. Square root of 2 is about, so I'm going to change these to about symbols, negative 1.4. Negative 1.4. And remember, when we're graphing, it's okay to have approximations. Okay? And I'm just going to kind of fill these in. You'll just have to trust me that these are the answers you get when you solve them, just to save some time. Okay, we get this because when we plug in 6, we get 4, and the square root of 4 is 2. We throw the negative on it at the end. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and graph this. So now when we graph this one, once again, being careful, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, which I'm not going to need all of those because the highest, or actually I should be going into the negatives, right? I don't even have positive values. So 1, let's actually extend the graph down here. 1, 2, 3, which I don't even need to go down to 3 because I only have values down to negative 2. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, let's plot all these. So once again, I don't have any values at 0. I don't have any values at 1. So my graph actually starts at positive 2. So 2, 0. And I go to 3, negative 1. And then I go to 4, negative 1.4. Okay. And then I go to 5, negative 1.7. And then 6, negative 2. Okay? Create our little kind of a sideways half of a parabola there. Okay, and that's what our graph should look like. So for these ones, we don't want to just graph them, but we also have to describe what's happening with the domain and what's happening with the range. Okay, so if I'm looking at the x values, I notice that I've got my x value starting at 2, so x, and then it's going further to the right here, okay? So my x values are increasing. So x is greater than or equal to 2. That's the smallest x value I can have. Everything else is going to be bigger. And then for my y values, I'm actually starting at 0. Do you see how this is 0 right here? 0 for my y value. And I'm not going up, I'm actually going down for my y values, okay? So these ones are going down. So I've got y is less than or equal to 0, okay? So once again, when I'm looking at the domain, I'm looking at everything moving this way, okay? If I'm moving this way on the graph, I start at 2 and I go up the scale. And if I'm looking at my y values, I'm looking at what's going this way, okay? I'm starting at 0 and I'm going down, okay? If I'm looking at things vertically, okay? So that's how we find these values. So I want you to do that for, let's do page 505, numbers 4 through 6, all, okay? So what you're gonna do is you're gonna graph them first, just like we did, and then you need to describe the domain and range. All right, so you're going to graph it by creating a table and then describe it by the domain and range. So when you do this, you're going to have to really pay attention. What values are going to work for my table? I should not have even had a 0 or a 1 in here, right? You need to have some foresight. You need to be able to see, okay, if I plug in a 0 here, I'm going to get a no solution. So I don't want to use 0. If I plug in a 1 here, I'm also going to get a no solution. So I don't want to plug in 1. I want to start with what's going to give me 0 as my answer. Okay? That's what you should be looking towards. All right. So go ahead and do those and we'll come back.